In this second video on the history of transportation, we'll look at the early 1800s all the way through the Civil War up to the Antebellum period. After independence in the early 1800s, nationalism swept across the country. Not only did Americans want to spread their country westward, they wanted to develop it. They called these developments internal improvements. Simply put, the government encouraged the construction of projects like roads, bridges, and canals, the so-called internal improvements. One way the federal government tried to encourage internal improvements was chartering private companies to build turnpikes, or as they're known today, toll roads, privately owned roads. And a person would travel a road and he would have to pay a toll at the toll house where a guy would collect it and live, and then they would travel the road. Now shown here is a traveler paying at the toll house. The toll roads were expensive operations because what the companies would do is they'd often have plank roads to keep it becoming impassable with mud. And the wood, of course, would deteriorate and required constant maintenance. And that was a real big cost for a lot of these toll companies. When you start getting a little bit closer to the antebellum age, 1830s, 1840s, what you're seeing are roads called macadamized roads. What they would do is they would crush stones together, and then when they would have wheels of wagons go over them, it would drive the crushed stone into the soil and would give it a lot of traction. These macadamized roads were named for a guy named McAdam that first developed them, but they were graded so water would flow off to the side, and they were a dramatic improvement. Although toll companies would use macadamized roads, it was still a very expensive operation. Toll roads suffered financially not only from the ongoing maintenance costs, but also from the development of what they called Shunpikes. And I said that you'd pay a toll with a toll house and you'd be allowed to follow the road. The trouble is people knew a toll house was coming up, and they would kind of go out on a path through the jungle or whatever, the nearby area, and then bypass the toll house and get back on the road. And so this was often called a shunpike. And if you're going to run a toll company, not only did you then have to have a toll guy, but you have to have that toll guy constantly patrolling the road. And that was it got very, very expensive from that perspective. Now, when I talk about roads, I want you to keep in mind that as we go westward, they're certainly growing from the colonial period, but they're still remaining quite primitive. Often in the West, nothing more than horse or rutted wagon trails. Again, however, the quantity and quality of roads were far greater in the more populated urban North than the rural agricultural dominated South, as we talked about before. In the early 1800s, the nation was really in a sort of a fervor of nationalism. Everybody thought that we were just awesome and we should grow westward. Well, the area that was growing the most was what they call the Northwest area, the area of Ohio, and that most of the population was in the north, and it's not surprising that northern western area was growing the most. But in this era of fervent nationalism, you're actually going to see another way that the federal government encouraged internal improvements. They actually paid for a federally funded road. And it was built in several stages, but it was to go from Maryland all the way out to the Mississippi River eventually. And then it would, of course, connect there and people could go down the Mississippi River. This was controversial because people said, why should we have federal tax dollars going to pay for this road when not everybody who pays federal tax dollars benefits from it? And if I'm in Georgia and I'm paying some type of federal tariff or tax and my money is going to the national road, then how am I benefiting? And other people would argue, well, the United States becomes stronger and you're part of the United States. So, in theory, you'd benefit as well. But this was a very, very controversial decision. In the era of nationalism in the early 1800s, they went ahead and did it. You can still see some of the original National Road if you're up in that area of the country. It roughly parallels Route 40, or I should say the U.S. Highway 40 parallels the National Road. Here you can see a picture of one of the bridges in the National Road, the original bridges. After the early national period, the debate grew over whether the federal government should fund internal improvements like roads directly. During Andrew Jackson's presidency, there was a debate over federal funding for the Maysville Road, which was completely within one state, Kentucky. And people said that, well, that's because Henry Clay and the Kentucky's representatives were powerful in Washington, and people were protesting. Well, the bill to fund it passed Congress. You can see the blue, the areas that voted for it, and the yellow here, the areas that voted against it. But it didn't matter because Andrew Jackson vetoed it. Andrew Jackson didn't think that the federal government should fund this one road in one state. In the first video, I noted that ocean-going boats could often go up these rivers on the East Coast as far as the falls of the river. Well, how about getting past the falls? If you get past the rocks at the falls, maybe you can go back up, use the river again. And so what ends up happening is that the government also encouraged canal building as a form of internal improvements. And these canals would be dug around the rocks in the falls. And eventually, if you went all the way farther enough up, you'd really just be on the canal the whole time. But or the canal would always have, is very shallow, and there'd be flat-bottom boats that would be pulled by horses that would follow on a path nearby. And here you can see an old canal path. But anyway, this allowed ocean-going boats to go up to the falls, and then they would unload and put it on a flat-bottom boat, and it could follow up the canals, parts of the river, parts of the canals where the river was unpassable, all the way up almost to the mountains. Of course, construction of canals itself was expensive, and even though the U.S. government would charter private companies to do it, the private companies would have to put out some serious cash. The canals, as you got close to the mountain, elevation began to decline, and you had to construct locks, and that involved the most modern technologies for their day. Here you can see an old lock on the right from an old canal. The most famous canal, and most important canal, was actually as early as 1811, and it was known as the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal was first promoted by the government of New York. The New York Governor DeWitt Clinton convinced the New York legislature to provide revenue for a connection of for the construction of a canal from the falls of the Hudson River westward to Lake Erie, which was 363-mile route. And this was absolutely critical because all the ships on the Great Lakes and all the towns on the Great Lakes could get to the canal with their boats shipping goods, and then they could put these goods on flatbed boats. They could float eastward on the canal to the Hudson River. And there they could get on ocean-going boats and go down the Hudson River to New York and out into Atlantic. And therefore it opened the entire Great Lakes to the to the commerce of the Atlantic. The task of building the Erie Canal was absolutely tremendous. I mean, thick forest had to be cut, stumps uprooted, locks designed and built, and you can still see some of these out in New York today. They had to create cement, what amounted to cement waterproofing, which was expensive and time-consuming. It took years, and as the Erie Canal was finally completed in 1825 at a cost of under $10 million. It was 40 feet wide at its widest and 20 feet wide at its narrowest, but it was shallow, only 4 or 5 feet deep. As I say, flatbed boats would carry the cargo. But in spite of all the cost, it was a tremendous success. thousands of people used the canal each year, paying the state toll. And the state made a lot of money off that. And it promoted the idea, that it promoted the idea that canals could be profitable. And all these private, canal companies would then try to get chartered to build their own canals all throughout the United States. Attendant to the growing early industrial revolution was rapid improvements in communication and transportation, especially in ocean travel, which made international trade increase. In fact, the first week of 1818, ships of the Blackball Line inaugurated a weekly transatlantic packet service between New York and Liverpool, and that was the first regularly scheduled transatlantic commerce. They were known as the Blackball Line because they had a black ball in their sails, and you could see it from far away, as shown in this picture here. After the Panic of 1819, the packet business grew in a tremendous rush, and by the end of the 1830s, 52 transatlantic lines ran square riggers on schedules from New York, with 3 regular sailings per week. By the early 1840s, regularly scheduled ships began to sail from other American ports as well. I should note as an aside that the sleek and super-fast clipper ships shown here, they were almost twice as fast, came out a little bit later in 1845, and that dramatically increased transatlantic commerce and travel. Of course, in the early industrial revolution of the early 1800s, what really dramatically improved travel was the use of steam. Going back into the late 18th century, the first use of steam was invented by James Watt in Britain, and you can see his steam engine here. By the way, if you look at a unit of power, you think of watts of electricity. Well, that's named for James Watt. The first use of steam was applied to the production of textiles. Like they would apply steam and it would make the textile mills run better, but it wasn't long before people applied steam to boats. You have a paddle wheel powered by steam that can mean a boat could go against the current, and this is really important. If you have a river and you want to go up the river, it's difficult to go against the current. Now, if you're coming down the river, you can just float down with the current. Think of Huck Finn on the Mississippi. But if you're going up the river with the sailboat, you kind of have to tack back and forth. And when you have steam, however, you can just plow against the current and the winds. It just speeds everything up. The first person to apply steam to a boat with this paddle wheel was a guy named Robert Fulton. And in 1809, he had his first steamship, which he called Clermont, shown here. By the 1830s, steamboats had grown very, very large and much more powerful. And they'd begun to make cities along the rivers like St. Louis and on the Mississippi River grow tremendously. You got a map showing how big St. Louis had gone. Along the river of St. Louis, you'd have just all of these steamboats lined up in the Antebellum age. Of course, people were thinking very early about how to apply steam to wagons, and they found that it was difficult because the ruts in the ground, you needed a smooth surface, otherwise there wouldn't be enough power to go. And so what they did was they tried putting a steam-powered wagon on rails. And of course, you know where this is going. It's going to lead to the modern railroad. The first person to do this was a guy named Peter Cooper as early as the 1820s, and he called his steam-powered locomotive Tom Thumb, and it became quite famous. By the mid-1830s, smaller local railroads beginning to appear. All of them were private endeavors, and they had different locomotives and different widths and the gauges of the track. Railroads were quickly advancing, and by the end of the Antebellum age, it was absolutely amazing how far they've come. Railroads were, they're more important because they not only speed up travel for commerce, but they carry goods further and faster and cheaper. And they stimulated the demand for a lot of other products and created a lot of other new industries. I should also note that while railroads were growing and successful in this period, they ended the canal age. Most canal companies went bankrupt. In any event, a look at the total number of railroad miles shows how fast railroads grew. In 1830, there were only 23 miles of railroads. In 1840, there were approximately 2,800 miles. In 1850, there were just over 9,000 miles. But by 1860, there were 30,000 miles. And most of these were in the north, which is not too surprising. And it's going to be obviously influential in stimulating the Industrial Revolution up north and the growth of cities up north. And it's going to play a role in the Civil War as well. In the antebellum age, you begin to see the first sort of mass transit in cities, not between towns, but within the city. You had regularly scheduled horse-drawn wagons going throughout towns early in the 1800s, and they called them the omnibus. And you would pay a fee and get on and ride, and you knew where it was going throughout the city. As time passed by, these the omnibuses got bigger and they put them on rails, which were easier for these horses to follow, and they became known as horse cars. But in any event, this is kind of the first mass transit, if you want to call that, in these growing antebellum cities. As early as the early 1800s, and certainly picking up when you get to the 1830s and 1840s, people were exploring the Rocky Mountains. They were going across the plains and they're going up into the Rocky Mountains. And very early on, the people that did that were known as mountain men. They were trappers and fur traders and were kind of they kind of blended in with the Native Americans. And but they did open up the knowledge of the Rocky Mountains and made it easier to get to the West Coast, as we'll see. They learned that the best way through these massive Rocky Mountains was through the so-called South Pass, and it was in southern Wyoming. And so all of these settlers in the 1840s we're going to talk about that were going westward would always travel through the famous South Pass. These travelers traveling westward to the West Coast, inevitably going through the South Pass, would travel together along established routes across the Great Plains and, as I say, into and over the Rocky Mountains. These pioneers were not just men, adventurers like earlier. They were entire families, and they would try to leave on their journey in the spring, and that would allow them to go as fast as they can to get over the Rocky Mountains before the winter snows hit. The weather was more than just a challenge in the Rocky Mountains. It could be a challenge anytime. And the trip, of course, was dangerous for other reasons, mainly Indian attacks. When the Indians attacked, the pioneers would circle their wagons for protection, as you can see in this picture here. As the word of early settlers drifted out and more people began to travel westward, they would follow the markings of people that went before them. And an established route to Oregon began to be called the Oregon Trail. In 1843, 1,000 immigrants traveled it, and by 1845, it was up to 3,000. And by 1852, over 10,000 people. There had already been a trail, a commercial trail to the Mexican Commerce Center of Santa Fe moving southwest. The Oregon Trail went northwest and went through the South Pass of the Rocky Mountains. West of the South Pass, the major trails split as some went to the northwest continuing on the Oregon Trail, while others went southwest along what became known as the California Trail. The California Trail ended at Sutter's Fort, which is now Sacramento, California, and that has easy access from there to the Bay Area. When they began early on, many left from the city of St. Louis. That's not surprising. That was where Lewis and Clark had departed from, and other early explorers. For that reason, St. Louis is sort of considered the gateway to the West, and that's why they built that St. Louis Arch, which you can see here. Perhaps you've been there. But by the 1840s, the Missouri was starting to be developed pretty well, and people would depart from a town further west, which was Independence, Missouri, was the new departing area. The first few days were okay. The plains were flat, and the path was generally easy to follow. It was well marked, and everybody was fresh and excited, and you could make as many as 20 miles a day. At the end of the second day, about 40 miles west of Independence, a signpost directed them to the road to Oregon. Others would split off at this point and travel that Santa Fe Trail southwest to the city of Santa Fe. From this point, it took about 3 weeks to travel the 350 miles across the flat plains until they reached Fort Laramie. As the Oregon Trail grew in popularity, the U.S. government tried to maintain these forts to sort of aid and protect the migrants. And the reality was, however, that the settlers probably are put more at risk by these forts because the Indians saw them as something permanent. After Fort Laramie, it was about 100 miles until the migrants started climbing into the mountain country. They would they'd often find that their Conestoga wagon wasn't going to make it, wasn't going to cut it after it'd been great for a while but didn't last. And they'd have to lighten their load by selling or simply dumping heavy items. One report of the trail debris told of, quote, bar iron and steel, large blacksmith anvils and bellows, crowbars, drills, augers, gold washers, chisels, axes, lead, trunks, spades, plows, large grindstones, baking ovens, cooking stoves, kegs, barrels, and clothing, all left behind. If traders were there, they might trade animals for fresh ones, and everyone, of course, stocked up on the food they'll need: bacon, beans, and coffee. If a trader was there, and obviously the traders would pick up on what had been left behind. The next marker was Independence Rock in what's now central Wyoming, 838 miles west, and a landmark towards the South Pass. Many migrants inscribed their names on a rock that became known as the Register of the Desert. You can see some of that graffiti on the right here, and the Independence Rock today, which is a state park, on the left. About 70 miles west of Independence Rock, they reached the South Pass, and this carried them over the Continental Divide at about 7,500 feet altitude. From this point on, they went 123 miles to Fort Bridger, where cavalry patrols and military escorts might be available to some of the lucky trail parties. Several hundred miles west, now about 1,300 miles or so from Independence where they'd started, they came to Fort Hall, which is on the Snake River. Originally, it had been a British fort. From here, the migrants could head southwest on the California Trail over the Sierra Nevada mountains to Sutter's Fort if they wanted. So Fort Hall was an important location, and you could again get traders there as the migrants split to California and Oregon. The Oregon Trail migrants would roughly then follow the Snake River until they reached the Columbia River, which, if they wanted, took them to a terminus in what's now Portland, Oregon. That was about 2,000 miles from Independence where they'd begun, but it took them right through the Willamette Valley. If you took the California Trail, however, it had to go through the Sierra Nevada mountains, and if one didn't make good time on the earlier trip, you might, or if you'd not left early enough, you might be trying to pass over the Sierra Nevada mountains in winter, and that was perilous. If you don't believe me, just ask the Donner family, who they tried to cross the Sierra Nevada too late, and they got caught in the snow, 1846 and 1847, and a number of them died. And there's evidence that they resulted in in their starvation, they resulted to cannibalism. Whenever you were traveling on these roads, over time, of course, they developed. And if you were crossing rivers, before you'd have to forge them, but now you'd probably be able to, as time goes along, you'd probably be able to get a ferry. And the ferries are flat-bottom boats propelled by large poles pushing off the bottom of the river, or by ropes pulled all the way across the river, and people aboard the flat-bottom boat would pull the rope and get across. And there were times when so many people were traveling westward that there'd be a backup on the banks of the river waiting for the ferry to get back. In any event, this concludes the second video on the history of American transportation, taking us up almost to the Civil War.